The original Nanjing Memorial enlarged the rift between the Japanese and Chinese people, and it did not seek to mourn the event in an unbiased fashion. Therefore, the purpose of our annex is to use history to show how conformity affected the individual. This poses a plausible explanation as to why events such as the Nanjing Massacre occur.
In the exterior, the annex is in the shape of a hexagon, and hexagon designs are throughout the exterior and interior. This design is inspired by the shape of the central part of a beehive, representing the hive mind. A hive mind is a concept that basically means a group of people or animals losing their individuality to come together as a group. This group usually has one overlord, one that collects information from all the members and uses it to make decisions best for the group. And this phenomenon is apparent in animals such as bees and ants. It responds to our answer to the driving question, the loss of individuality within conformity, and it's an important lesson to learn about what caused the conformity, such as indoctrination and education. Humans also fall into the trend of making decisions based off the actions of others, and specifically, in the event of the Nanjing Massacre, people behaved according to their role obligations and obeyed without thinking about the consequences. The Japanese soldiers also believed that they were carrying out a divine mission under the authority of the superior emperor, and they ought to obey because they were only a small part of the whole greater good. Therefore, the idea of a hexagon became a motif of our design. The hexagons represent the hive mind and the influence that was put onto individuals in that time period. One of the purposes of the design is to show how Japanese were indoctrinated and influenced to conform. People have less capacity for cruelty if they believe that the act is wrong. Therefore, acts need to be justified. In the book Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl reflected, "It did not really matter what we expected from life, but rather what life expected from us." This addresses the indoctrination of the soldiers, as the Japanese soldiers believed that the things that their lives expected from them is to serve the nation and imperial family as much as they could as a whole, and the killing of the dehumanized figures are very minor compared to the greater good. The Japanese soldiers had to be integrated into the hive mind so that they would obey without question.
The pressure to conform to authority was reinforced in the military, where obedience and the sense of being a small part of achieving a greater mission were taught and believed. Punishments, propaganda, and surveillances reinforced conformity. Therefore, the individual did not have the need to experience personal moral choices, because people behaved accordingly through their role obligations to the emperor and obeyed with little thinking about the moral consequences when their acts seemed to be for a divine mission and killing became a routine. Defenses similar to a jail gives a strong existing pressure to a viewer so the audience can comprehend the feeling that it is extremely hard to escape from the influence and requires a lot of determination and effort to overcome it. The bridge represents the ability of a person to recognize the humanity of others. Before you enter the installation, it's transparent so you can see through the pond, the Nanjing Massacre, and see the death and violence at the bottom. You can recognize the humanity. After you exit, you cannot see through the bridge anymore, representing how most Japanese people lost their ability to recognize the humanities of the humans they've killed. The audience goes through the system of indoctrination and realizes why the Japanese would be unconscious of the humanity of the killed Chinese. All of this surrounds the center, the hexagon representing the military, ideology, and the government, the authority and what controls the system. The transparent spheres represent the newborn children going through the hexagons or the system and falling to the red pond representing the Nanjing Massacre along with other spheres because of the indoctrination. The red pond is red color base with normal water on top in order to avoid contaminating the water. Through these aspects of symbolization, the audience realizes that only the people who could detach from the indoctrination could see the massacre as an unjustified action. There were people that felt that the acts were extremely immoral, but the majority of the country felt that the war was justified. On the annex, the crumbled traditional wall represents how the old traditional ideas of confining within the borders in Japan is gone because of inner issues, and Japan wants to militarily expand its territory. The roof-like figures show how China and Japan had a cultural similarity, and they not only humanize the Japanese, they also show that how indoctrination and conformity are universal rather than confined to the Japanese people, which strengthen our purpose. The exterior demonstrates the idea of how individuality could conform when there are inner issues, and an ideology that creates a system that controls people to conform. For this overall design, we'll try to make it as energy efficient as possible, and here are the methods we plan to use.
The hexagons on the roof are solar panels. The panels are used to produce energy necessary to fuel the building. We use insulated concrete forms, also known as ICFs, for our walls of the building because it reduces conduction and convection. The materials of the ICFs are foam boards or blocks. The advantages of using ICFs is that the insulation is built into the walls, which then creates high thermal resistance. ICF buildings outperform framed buildings with compared stated R values when thinking about energy efficiency as well as other benefits because of the three factors that impact the performance, which are thermal conduction, convection, and also radiation and mass. The R value measures conduction, which is thermal energy transfer through a material by contact of one molecule with another. In addition, we have plant walls, which surround the building. The plant walls allow us to control the temperatures of our environment so that we do not have to use heating systems or cooling systems as much. Therefore, during the summers, the plants store the heat as a source for energy. They also reduce the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere and release oxygen as a product. As for structural integrity, ICFs contain a central cavity which can be used to store concrete, which increases the stability.
Solar panels, plant walls, ICFs all increase energy efficiency and reduce energy loss. These features will help us meet the COP21 standards.
This is the interior of our annex. The structure you see fits within the exterior structure, so when you walk into the building depicted in the exterior design, you would see this. Each panel in our interior design has a corresponding hologram. The hologram represents a Chinese or Japanese person depending on which wall it's on, and the corresponding panel represents the surroundings of that person. So how the interior design works is when the visitor first enters, the building is completely dark. As the visitor progresses down the hallway, the panels and their corresponding holograms light up one by one in chronological order. This way, the panels and holograms tell a tale of the Japanese and Chinese history leading up to the event, as well as some of the aftermath. These two walls start off close together, then diverge, and then converge. This not only causes the building to have a hexagonal shape, which reinforces our design motif of a hexagon, but it also represents how the Japanese and Chinese cultures started similarly, then diverged due to the influence of conformity, but in the end, the similarities between the cultures, as well as human resilience, brings the people back together to break the influence of the hive mind. This corresponds with the purpose of our building.
By limiting the amount of visitors per day, we can reduce the amount of energy used for air conditioning. Also, in our interior, our panes light up one by one, which will limit the amount of energy used for lighting. These features will enable us to meet COP21 standards.
In the first panel on the Japanese side, the influence being placed on the individual is minimal. The hologram corresponding to this panel is the same as the one corresponding to the one on the Chinese side, indicating that they are very similar.
Japan draws a lot of their culture from the Chinese society, which is why they share a large amount of similarities. This was represented by the similar style of housing in our interior design.
In the second panel, education is beginning to indoctrinate the individual. At this stage, the holograms have separated, as conformity is influencing the individual and causing the Japanese and Chinese sides to diverge.
The two societies also share a lot of similarities in education. Chinese children were under huge amounts of pressure from both their parents and their peers.
In the third panel, the individual is fully integrated into the hive mind system. In the Japanese case, this is when the person joins the military. This panel is covered with hexagons to show the huge amount of influence being exerted onto the individual.
In the more modernized cities, China received a lot of Western influence, unlike the Japanese who decided to kick out the Westerners.
This is the panel at the furthest point of division between the two cultures, where the Nanjing massacre occurred. At this point, the influence of conformity on the individual is also extreme, as it is the influence of conformity that pushes the individual to commit unspeakable horrors, such as the Nanjing massacre.
The massacre was the point where these two cultures were the furthest apart. Chinese citizens were brutally raped and murdered when the Japanese army took over Nanjing.
The fifth panel depicts a broken flag as well as exploding hexagons. This represents how the influence of the hive mind shattered when the Imperial Japanese order was destroyed and the soldiers were freed from the influence of conformity, and they were given the opportunity to become an individual once more.
Under the leadership of Mao, the Chinese unified once again, forming a nation. This was represented in the design by the broken pieces of hexagon turning into regular hexagons.
In the last panel, there is a Ren character and bowls of rice on the table. Language and cuisine are two common points between the Japanese and Chinese cultures, so we use those to enforce the message that the similarities between the two cultures, as well as our human resiliency, allows us to surpass the influence of conformity.
In our sixth panel, we bring in our main message that we want to deliver to our audience. It is important to remember that we are all human and that it is important not to repeat history. In conclusion, our design focuses on how conformity can push an individual to commit unspeakable horrors, but in the end, our humanity allows us to break free of that influence and become an individual once more.